It was March of 1960, and a plane rose into the sky above Bario, a community of a few Malaysian villages. It belonged to the Royal Air Force of the United Kingdom, and as it flew over the island, it dropped a load. Usually the cargo was welcome and eagerly awaited by the locals, but this time it was unlike anything else in the world. No one had ever attempted anything like this before. People dropped what they were doing and looked up at the sky, trying to figure out what was going on, and all because hidden among all the cargo were baskets full of live cats. They were in boxes strapped to parachutes, but even so, it was a mind-blowing sight. Paratrooper cats were gearing up to launch an operation to help the people. Rats were everywhere. So today, we've got a story that's totally worthy of Plague Tale. Let's dive in, right after coffee. Just an unobtrusive reminder to do that little thing under the video in case you forget. First, let's figure out the location where all of this happened. Bario is a village made up of 13 to 16 villages located in the Kilabit Highlands in the Miri Division, Sarawak, Malaysia. And it's actually pretty high up, sitting at 3,280 feet above sea level. These days, it's part of Malaysia, but at the time of the events we're going to talk about today, it was a British colony. And the story kicked off well before the Feline landing, and it started with malaria. Although malaria has been haunting humanity throughout history, it was only at the 8th World Health Assembly held in Mexico City in May 1955 that officials from around the world agreed that malaria could be eradicated, and the WHO should take care of this. In fact, people had already been successfully fighting malaria in many parts of the world, especially in Europe, the United States, and Venezuela. The fairly rich experience made it clear that the disease could be wiped out by residual spraying of insecticides. To put it simply, just spraying mosquitoes with poison. It was the malaria mosquitoes that quickly spread the deadly disease among the population through bites from infected females. In Malaysia, they tried to fight them. During the initial campaign in Sarawak from 1952 to 1955, both DDT and another insecticide, benzene hexachloride, were sprayed. The spraying was done only inside residential buildings. Each village had these long houses, large buildings with thatched roofs where up to 100 families could live. Before applying the insecticide, it was mixed with water to make a 75% solution, then applied to the walls and under the beds. The walls were especially important because mosquitoes land on them first. That's why they were coated with enough substance to kill the insects before they could bite a person and infect them. The treatment paid off. During the 21-month period in Sarawak from 1953 to 1955, the percentage of mosquitoes carrying the malaria parasite dropped from 35.6% to 1.6%. The organizers of the operation were pleased and claimed that complete eradication could be expected in the near future. However, the WHO didn't anticipate the unforeseen consequences of their well-meaning actions. No one thought about the cats. Cats, as we know, really love to lick themselves. They rested after a day spent hunting and wiping out unwanted pests like mice and rats, and while licking, they ended up ingesting the toxic DDT that stayed on their fur. DDT is a deadly substance for the nervous system, and this problem became international. There were reports of cats dying from DDT effects in Thailand, Bolivia, and Mexico. In the 1970s, Oaxaca, Mexico pest control workers who used DDT were even called Los Matagatos, meaning cat killers. Partly for this reason, today DDT is considered too harmful to use. It's even banned in many countries because it can build up in the bodies of animals and, accordingly, humans. But back in the 1940s and 1950s, people didn't know this, and everyone thought it was great stuff. After all, DDT really did the job with mosquito extermination, and the cats? Well, apparently they were just collateral damage. But while the Malaysian cats were dying off, the rat population, without worrying about their main enemy, was rapidly growing. This quickly created a threat to the crops and raised concerns about the spread of other equally dangerous diseases like typhus and the plague. Rats have become so numerous that they've taken over the cities and almost completely destroyed the food supplies. It's not just about their numbers, but also their audacity. Rats are naturally pretty bold, and when there's no predator around, they stop being afraid of anything. They might even start attacking people, especially those who seem particularly defenseless to them. Rice fields deserve a special mention as they were especially affected by the rat invasion. The damage started right away because the rats eagerly ate even the freshly scattered seeds. If the rice managed to sprout, the rats would eat the young shoots. They also fed on the rice grains in the mature plants. Rats can also damage the rice mounds, those that are located between the irrigated rice paddies. They dig holes, build tunnels, and even nest in them, which often leads to the embankments collapsing. But worst of all, rice fields, where there's food, water, and shelter, become the perfect place for rats to breed, and rats breed very actively. Scientifically speaking, they have high reproductive rates. Rats start breeding at 3 to 5 months old, carry their babies for 21 to 33 days, and have 6 to 12 pups per litter. They can have 4 to 7 litters a year, so a pair of rats and their offspring can produce up to 1,500 rats in just 1 year, if all of them survive. Even if there were only about 1,000 rats, that was already too many, especially since these hordes of rodents weren't afraid of anything. Officer Malcolm McSporran, who was in Bario during the inspection of the runway restoration, said that once a rat chewed a hole in his pillow while he was sleeping on it. Apparently, the rat was gathering materials for a nest. Good thing it didn't drag McSporran himself off. But was the rat epidemic really caused by the mosquito poison? Well, at first, experts thought that the rat population explosion was most likely due to a combination of factors: humidity, climate, food availability, and above all, the government's failure to provide enough rat poison. But then the facts came in. A toxologist from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta analyzed a dead cat. That's how they figured out that the levels of DDT found were high enough to kill this animal and many other cats. And although it wasn't really proven that the rat invasion was caused by mosquito poison, it still sounds, well, kind of logical. However, scientists are still fiercely debating this. By the way, rats weren't the only consequence of the pesticide spraying. After the WHO-led team sprayed insecticides to wipe out malaria, representatives from the Sabah and Sarawak regions started complaining about the poor quality of straw roofs. The reason was that the moth larvae somehow avoided DDT, while their main enemy, the little calcid wasp, turned out to be very sensitive to the poison. As a result, there were fewer wasps and 50% more moth caterpillars, and they ate the straw roofs. Moreover, birds were affected. After the poison was sprayed, witnesses said the birds just disappeared. At least where they had always been heard before, there was an eerie silence. The potentially lethal effect of DDT on birds was first noticed in the late 1950s. Researchers found that earthworms were accumulating a persistent pesticide and that the robins eating them got poisoned. Other birds became victims too. The worst part was that large concentrations of chlorinated hydrocarbons usually don't kill birds right away. Rather, DDT and similar substances disrupt the bird's calcium metabolism in such a way that the eggshells become thin. Instead of eggs, heavily poisoned brown pelicans and bald eagles typically find omelets in their nests, as the eggshells can't handle the weight of the birds sitting on them. So dust led to a decline in the population of the American brown pelican across much of North America and the extinction of the peregrine falcon in the eastern U.S. and southeastern Canada. And these are just a few of the affected species. There's a lot more to say about the impact of DDT on birds. But let's get back to the rats. To prevent the devastating damage caused by rats to the crops and reduce the likelihood of people being infected with various rat-borne diseases, they decided it was time to call in the Royal Air Force of the United Kingdom. They arrived on a Blackburn B-101 Beverly plane designed for transporting paratroopers or cargo. It's not a coincidence. On March 13, 1960, the crew of a transport plane took off from Changi, Singapore, and made a unique drop in Bario in the Kelabit Highlands in Sarawak. A total of 3 tons of supplies were dropped, including more than 20 cats to fight the rats that were threatening the crops. A response from the ground came soon. All the paratrooper cats had landed safely. Actually, there's no need to worry about the cats' safety, not just because they were packed so carefully. Among the items and supplies dropped, besides the cats, there were, for example, 4 boxes of stout for the recovering chieftain, as well as medical alcohol. None of this broke. The soldiers knew exactly what they were doing and how to drop even very fragile items. At the same time, air delivery was the most reasonable solution. Just a reminder, the drop-off point for the cat mission's pretty high up, and getting there by road, well, it's tricky. It's much easier to send the cats by air. Actually, not all the cats were dropped by parachute for the operation. In Sabah, they gathered the cats in cities and transported them by trucks. It was only in the far-off mountain villages that the Air Force had to step in. By the way, where did all these cats come from? I searched for some information and found a newspaper article in the English-language Singaporean newspaper, the Straits Times, from March 1960. Actually, it wasn't even an article, but a call for cats. Wanted, 30 flying cats to rout rats. Soon, the residents of Kuching, the capital of Sarawak, also known affectionately as the City of Cats, gathered 23 cats to help the people of Bario. One of the reports I found also says that the Kuching Fire Brigade was called in to gather cats to save the rice harvest in Bario. After the cats were gathered, an Air Force plane was called in to take the precious cargo to its destination. Unfortunately, it was cloudy that day, and the plane had to fly to Kota Kinabalu to wait for better weather. At night, the cats were released into a secure shed so they could be prepared for release again in the morning. In the morning, however, a small problem arose. The cats weren't too eager to get back into their baskets, so they had to be wrestled with a bit. But in the end, the people won. The plane took off, and this time it was rerouted to Brunei because the clouds wouldn't clear. Later, the weather improved, and then, scratched and irritated, the crew dropped the cats on parachutes in Bario. We don't know how badly the crew was hurt because it's unclear how many cats were sent to the war with the rats. Newspaper reports published shortly after the operation only mentioned 23 cats. Some unreliable and later reports of the event claim that up to 14,000 cats were used. But that number sounds just insane. Another source mentions the recruitment of 30 cats just days before the operation. In the operations record book of the Beverly Flight of 48 Squadron, which recorded the amount of cargo dropped in that area, it actually says 20 cats, so I think 23 is the closest to the real number. But could 24 cats handle the rats? To answer this question, we'll have to turn to the newspapers again. Once again, the Straits Times, but this time to the publication from April 18, 1960. The article said the rats, which once threatened crops on the Kelabit Highlands located nearby, had disappeared thanks to the army of cats from the heaven. Locals sent a message, "Thanks for the cats, no more trouble with rats and mice." So I guess we can call the operation a success. However, this wasn't the first nor the only time people turned to feline troopers for help. In December 1953, the Royal Air Force delivered a cat to people in Fort Legap, Perak. The cat was sent in a special soft box along with rations to deal with the rats that were eating those very rations. It's unclear, though, whether the cat was dropped by parachute into Fort Legap. The short news report simply stated that a Royal Air Force plane dropped a live cat to the people. Several months later, the newspaper, the Straits Times, clearly reported that 2 cats had been dropped from a height of 347 feet in parachute containers from a Valletta plane of the Royal Air Force onto an airfield in Kuala Lumpur. The cats seemed to handle the experience just fine. As reported by an officer who witnessed their landing, both appeared to be cheerful. They didn't seem to be harmed at all by the parachute drop. Once the seals were broken, the cats jumped out of their airborne container, licked their paws, and walked off. In general, cat airdrops were quite common in practice, but on the spot they had to deal with problems. At least because the rats weren't about to just give up. Yes, cats were great hunters, but even the best hunters have bad days. One tragic case occurred in Sarawak in the mid-1960s. During the armed conflict between Indonesia and Malaysia, Australian military units were stationed in Sarawak to protect Malaysia from potential attacks by Indonesian forces. When the Australian troops took up their position in 1965, they found that the area was overrun with large rats. To solve the problem, they asked the Royal Army Corps for 5 cats, and the cats were provided. However, on April 22, 1965, the Straits Times reported some sad news. 5 cats airlifted to the front lines of the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, southeast of Kuching, to fight the rat infestation, became victims of war. The Australians said that large, aggressive rats simply killed the cats. Then Sarawak Tribune suggested using tame pythons, which were well known as Sarawak's rat hunters. In response to the news of the cats' deaths, the Air Force representatives in Labuan gave some advice to all military units sending cats to fight border rats. First, the cats need to be well fed to gather strength. The gray and brown tabby named Mum was brought in as proof that well-fed and cared-for cats can quickly deal with rats. She ate chicken, lamb, and fish in the officers' mess, and as a result, dealt with the rats perfectly and swiftly. Later, in response to a SOS request about a cat from the 101st Squadron in Bario, Mama and her 3 kittens were sent to service by helicopter. It was reported that the 4 of them held their own well against overwhelming odds. Further proof that you should eat well before an important task. Unfortunately, despite their combat abilities and ample food, there were cases when some cats weren't quite ready to do their job. In other words, they just didn't feel like working. On June 14, 1966, the same newspaper, the Straits Times, reported the disappearance of 2 domestic cats hired to reduce the bush rat population in the 4th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment. According to the article, 2 trackers from an Australian infantry unit on Borneo went AWOL after being on duty for less than an hour. All hope of finding them was given up and the search was called off. The military authorities say that if they show up, they'll face a military tribunal with the maximum penalty being 14 days of confinement in baskets and a diet of rice and fish heads. Harsh. All by the rules of wartime. Anyway, in the end, the Air Force stopped dropping cat paratroopers. It's unclear exactly when this happened, but it's easy to see why. It all comes down to progress in pest control. Eventually, alternative methods for dealing with the rat population emerged, and the road infrastructure improved even in the most remote areas. There was no longer any need to bring in planes to deliver anything there, including paratrooper cats. Well, I hope they got a decent military pension. You owe me a like. See you later.